In a bustling corporate office, the hum of activity filled the air as employees worked diligently, preparing for an upcoming major project presentation. The office, typically vibrant with the buzz of creative ideas and collaborative efforts, had become tense in the days leading up to the presentation. There was a sense of urgency in the air as deadlines loomed and expectations soared. Team members were focused, typing away at their computers, exchanging ideas and discussing strategies for their respective parts of the project. At the head of the office, overseeing the project's progress, was the manager, Lisa. She was known for her stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach to leadership. However, her style of management often crossed the line into micromanagement, and her critical nature made her unpopular with the team. Lisa's actions had a tendency to leave people feeling belittled and demoralized. Her habit of hovering over her employees, scrutinizing every detail, and nitpicking every aspect of the work made her an intimidating figure in the office. Among the employees was David, a black man in his late 20s who had worked hard to earn his position at the company. He was diligent, intelligent, and well-liked by his peers. Despite his contributions, he had often been the target of Lisa's sharp critiques. It wasn't that David wasn't doing his job. It was that Lisa had a habit of targeting him in particular, undermining his work and questioning his every move. The team had been preparing for weeks for the big presentation, but it was clear that the stress of the impending deadline had caused the tension in the room to rise. David, who had been tasked with compiling the final parts of the presentation, was working feverishly to meet the manager's high expectations. He had put in countless hours, reviewing data, refining the project, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. On this particular morning, the team gathered for a meeting to go over the final drafts of the project, when Lisa began her usual round of critiques. As she went through each team member's work, she found something to nitpick. She made sharp comments about formatting, phrasing, and even the smallest details that, in the grand scheme of things, didn't seem important. The tension in the room grew palpable, with eyes darting around nervously as each critique hit its mark. When the conversation shifted to David's part of the project, Lisa's condescending tone became even more evident, as she found a minor flaw in his report, something that seemed trivial in comparison to the overall scope of the project. Her criticism became louder and more intense. "You just don't get it, do you, David?" she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're supposed to be the one pulling this all together, but all you're doing is messing it up. You're just like a slave to these deadlines. All you're good for is doing the dirty work." The words hung in the air like a heavy, uncomfortable weight. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to David. His colleagues were visibly shocked, some holding their breath in disbelief, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. David could feel the blood rushing to his face as the insult reverberated through the room. Lisa, oblivious to the impact of her words, continued to glare at him as if she had said nothing out of the ordinary. David's heart raced, his initial shock fading into a mix of anger, frustration, and a sense of violation. He had been the target of Lisa's passive-aggressive behavior before, but this was different. This crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The silence in the room grew deafening as no one dared to speak up, and Lisa stood there, oblivious to the harm she had caused. David, however, was not going to let this pass. Something inside him stirred, a combination of rage and resolve that he had kept bottled up for years. In that moment, as his colleagues waited with bated breath, David's response would turn the entire office on its head. He straightened his back, took a deep breath, and with a calmness that contrasted with the intensity of the moment, he spoke. His voice was steady, unwavering, and full of dignity as he addressed Lisa and the stunned office. David had always prided himself on being a hard-working and conscientious individual. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood, he had learned from an early age that success wasn't just about talent, but about persistence, integrity, and character. His parents, who had both worked tirelessly to provide for their family, taught him the importance of self-respect and humility. They often reminded him that no matter what others might say or do, he was deserving of respect. This foundation helped David navigate the challenges he faced throughout his life, including the systemic obstacles that often accompanied his identity as a black man in a predominantly white society. From a young age, David showed an aptitude for academics and leadership. His teachers noticed his diligence and his ability to stay composed under pressure, and they encouraged him to pursue higher education. He graduated with honors, earning multiple degrees and accolades, including certifications in his field and a prestigious internship that set the stage for his successful career in the corporate world. David was well respected in his field, earning recognition for his intelligence, his professionalism, and his ability to approach problems with a level-headed and thoughtful demeanor. He never flaunted his successes, but instead let his work speak for itself. Over the years, David had worked his way up within the company, earning the trust of his colleagues and supervisors. He was known as someone who could handle even the most difficult situations with grace and tact, always prioritizing the success of the team over personal gain. However, despite his success, David had often found himself the target of subtle prejudices in the workplace. His intelligence and qualifications were sometimes dismissed or overshadowed by assumptions based on his race. He had learned early on to avoid engaging in unnecessary confrontations and instead focus on his work. Yet, as much as he tried to stay out of the spotlight and avoid office drama, the weight of these biases remained. This was where Lisa, his manager, entered the picture. Lisa had been with the company for many years, and despite her lack of people skills, she had managed to climb the corporate ladder. Her approach to leadership was anything but inspiring. She ruled over her team with an iron fist, constantly micromanaging and criticizing even the smallest details. The atmosphere in the office had always been tense under her rule, but most employees tolerated it, knowing that confronting Lisa would likely lead to retaliation. Lisa's behavior, both domineering and prejudiced, had caused many people to leave the company or switch departments, but her ability to maintain a veneer of professionalism, coupled with her political savvy, kept her in a position of power. Lisa's attitude toward her team members, particularly those from minority backgrounds, had become a well-known fact in the office. She had a tendency to belittle her employees, often dismissing their contributions in front of others. She made no effort to hide her bias, but no one dared to speak up. The fear of being targeted by Lisa and facing consequences for challenging her was enough to silence most of her subordinates. David, however, had always kept his head down, focusing on the job and avoiding her wrath as much as possible. Lisa's prejudices were not just subtle. Sometimes they were blatant. David had overheard her making dismissive comments about people of color during office lunches and meetings, but he had never directly confronted her. He had his reasons. He had worked hard to get where he was, and he didn't want to jeopardize his career for the sake of standing up to an unreasonable manager. Still, Lisa's constant undermining of his work had begun to wear on him. She frequently questioned his abilities, making snide remarks about his approach to tasks, even when his results spoke for themselves. David was well aware of the toxic environment that Lisa had cultivated, and although he didn't speak out, he often found solace in his personal life, spending time with friends who respected and admired him for who he was. They often encouraged him to find a better work environment, but David had always believed in perseverance. He had made it this far, and surely he could navigate the next challenge, whatever it might be. But Lisa's most recent outburst, calling him a slave in front of the entire office, crossed a line. David had reached his breaking point. He knew that he could not let this pass without standing up for himself, not only for his own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been marginalized by people like Lisa. This time, David would not remain silent. His upbringing had instilled in him a sense of resilience, and his years of training in the corporate world had made him prepared for this very moment. It was time for David to take a stand, not just for himself, but for every employee who had been belittled or made to feel small by those who abused their power. David remained seated for a moment, the sting of the words still hanging in the air. His coworkers sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to the manager's appalling outburst. The room was tense, every eye fixed on David, waiting to see how he would respond. His hands were steady as he placed the pen he had been holding down on the desk, his gaze fixed on Lisa, but there was no anger in his eyes. There was only calm, a silent strength that seemed to fill the room, radiating from his composed posture. Lisa's words had been an attack, a deep, cutting insult meant to belittle him, but David did not allow her cruelty to dictate his response. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't snap back with a sharp retort. Instead, he took a deep breath, the calmness in his demeanor a stark contrast to the rising tension in the room. He stood slowly, never breaking eye contact with Lisa, his silence more powerful than any words he could have shouted in fury. He wanted to make it clear that he would not be intimidated, that he was not just a passive recipient of her abuse. As David stood, the room seemed to hold its breath. Lisa's expression shifted from one of superiority to one of defensive confusion. She had expected him to react aggressively, to shout or perhaps even break down in front of his colleagues. Instead, David's stillness left her feeling small, exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. His stature wasn't defined by his physical height, but by the quiet power that came from his confidence in himself and his work. David took a step forward, his voice steady but resolute. "I want to address what just happened," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've just called me a slave, in front of everyone in this room." His gaze never left hers as he spoke, the words deliberate and clear. "That's not just an insult to me, Lisa. That's an insult to the values this company claims to uphold." There was no rise in his tone, no flare of anger, just a clear, calm statement of truth. This company promotes respect, diversity, and inclusion. We've all been told that these values are what make us stronger, what bind us together. And yet, in one breath, you've shown me none of those values. In one moment, you've revealed that your words and actions are nothing more than a facade. David paused, letting his words sink in. The office was silent, every employee fully aware of the gravity of what was happening. David wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been disrespected, overlooked, or undermined. He had worked here for years, contributing countless hours of his time and expertise. He had earned his place, not because of who he was, but because of what he had accomplished. He took another step closer to the manager, still composed but unwavering in his conviction. "I've been with this company for years. I've contributed to multiple projects that have brought us great success. I've received praise for my leadership, my strategic thinking, and my commitment to this team. But none of that matters to you, does it, Lisa? You don't see my accomplishments. You only see my skin color, and that's where your problem lies. Your words are a reflection of your inability to recognize the value in others. You see someone different and immediately you label them, degrade them, and dismiss their worth." David's voice grew slightly firmer as he continued, and those in the office could feel the growing support around him. Employees who had previously avoided conflict, who had feared speaking out against Lisa, now shifted in their seats. Some looked at each other, nodding silently. David's words had struck a chord with them. They had witnessed his contributions. They had respected his work. But they had also seen Lisa's cruel and dismissive attitude toward him, and toward others who didn't fit her narrow view of what success looked like. David addressed the entire room now, his tone still calm, but now filled with purpose. "I've earned my place here. I've earned my respect. And I will not tolerate being spoken to as if I am beneath anyone, no matter their title or position. This company is supposed to be a place of opportunity, a place where all employees, no matter their background, are valued for the skills and dedication they bring. But actions like yours, Lisa, undermine everything we're supposed to stand for." David let his words linger in the air, each one a challenge to the atmosphere of complacency that had allowed Lisa's behavior to persist unchecked for so long. His gaze shifted to the employees who had silently witnessed the confrontation, their faces reflecting a mixture of discomfort, surprise, and a slowly growing respect. David had laid bare the truth, and in doing so he had given them the courage to finally confront the elephant in the room. "You may have thought that your position would protect you," David continued, "but you've forgotten something important. It's not titles or power that earn respect. It's actions, integrity, and kindness. And right now, you have none of those." Lisa's face flushed with anger, her mouth opening and closing, but no words seemed to come out. The room was dead silent, and David's steady composure only emphasized how small Lisa had become in that moment. She had expected him to cower, to back down in the face of her power, but instead he had stood up for himself and for everyone who had been treated unjustly in this office. David's speech had left a lasting impression. As he finished, he gave a final, pointed look at Lisa, his words carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "I will not allow you to disrespect me. I will not allow Yahus to disrespect anyone. And I will make sure the people who run this company know exactly how you've treated me today." With that, David turned and walked out of the room, his head held high. The office was left in stunned silence. But one by one, employees began to stand up, their quiet support transforming into a collective statement of solidarity. For the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of pride and respect for the work they did, and for the man who had shown them how to stand up for themselves. David's powerful stand did not go unnoticed. In the days following the confrontation, employees began to feel emboldened. A quiet shift occurred in the office. Several colleagues who had previously kept their heads down, fearing the wrath of their manager, found themselves compelled to speak out. They began to quietly approach HR, sharing their experiences of Lisa's toxic behavior, stories of belittling remarks, unfair treatment, and a general culture of intimidation she had cultivated. One by one, Employees came forward, no longer afraid of retaliation, but instead determined to support David and expose the toxic atmosphere Lisa had fostered. HR, which had long turned a blind eye to Lisa's behavior, found itself with a growing list of complaints that it could no longer ignore. The overwhelming support for David, coupled with the stories from other employees, created a unified front that could not be dismissed. The pressure from within the office was undeniable, and HR was forced into action. A meeting was scheduled, and the uncomfortable reality of Lisa's behavior was put under scrutiny. David, meanwhile, had remained steadfast in his decision not to let the incident slide. His decision to call out the manager, as painful as it was, had ignited a much-needed conversation within the company. Employees were now rallying around him, seeing him not just as a colleague, but as a symbol of integrity and courage. His actions had brought to light the culture of fear and silence that had permeated the office for far too long. As HR investigated, it became clear that David's confrontation wasn't an isolated incident. Several employees had lodged complaints in the past, but they had either been ignored or buried under the weight of Lisa's position. There were reports of inappropriate comments, unprofessional conduct, and instances of discriminatory behavior. Lisa had made it clear to many that her authority in the office was not to be questioned. The truth of her actions had come to light in the most unexpected of ways, through the courage of one individual who refused to tolerate injustice. The investigation culminated in a swift and decisive decision. Lisa was fired from her position, her years of unchecked power brought to a sudden and dramatic halt. The company issued a formal apology to David, acknowledging that they had failed him in the past, allowing the situation to fester without intervention. It was a moment of accountability for the company, but it didn't undo the damage done by Lisa's actions. Still, the apology was a necessary step toward healing, a recognition that David's bravery had exposed a much larger issue within the organization. The aftermath of the incident reverberated throughout the company. There was a renewed focus on creating a safer, more inclusive workplace, with a commitment to addressing issues of harassment and discrimination head-on. David's actions had sparked change, but it was the collective voice of the employees that ensured the transformation would be lasting. Lisa's downfall was swift, and she found herself facing consequences beyond just losing her job. Her reputation, once built on a foundation of fear and manipulation, crumbled as the stories of her mistreatment became public. The company had no choice but to distance itself from her toxic influence. Her name became synonymous with prejudice and hostility, while David's name became associated with the kind of strength and dignity that everyone in the office admired. For David, the battle wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been made to feel small by someone in power. His actions had far-reaching consequences, but they were consequences that led to justice. The office was quieter in the days that followed, but there was an underlying sense of peace that had replaced the tension. The air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted off the shoulders of everyone who had witnessed the truth unfold. David's actions had created ripples, and those ripples would continue to spread. It was no longer just about one man's dignity. It was about the collective integrity of everyone who worked there. The office had changed for the better, and it was all because of one simple act of courage.